we're talking about unlawful deduction of wages, and the thing we need to think about is what is a deduction and is it unlawful? Now, when we think about a deduction, we think about things like deducting for a car, deducting for offsetting for your computer at home or something like that. But a deduction can also be your tax as well, because you're earning a certain amount of salary and some of that money is taken off for tax. And not a deduction would be superannuation, where your employer says this is how much you're earning plus super, or it includes super. So super is not considered a deduction in this environment. But let's talk about deductions that are not things like taxes for the ATO or PAYG withholding. Let's think about it as you are working and you're driving one of your company vehicles, and your employer has told you that if you crash the car, then you have to pay the excess. Now, that is a payment and if you agree to that, that's a payment that you're agreeing to make to your employer. But that's not necessarily means that your employer can deduct that directly out of your wages if and when that happens. You would need an agreement in writing to approve that deduction. Now, some contracts have authorised offsets and deductions already in it, and you would need to look at your employment contract to have a look to see if that's in there, because that would mean that your employer may be able to do that because you've already provided your written consent. Or your employer said, okay, so if you take the car out and you crash it, you pay the excess. And let's say you crash the car or you have an accident and the insurer needs to get involved and your employer wishes you to pay the excess. Then you need to have an agreement in writing with your employer to take that monies out of your pay. Now, it's super complicated with deductions because you only need to pay what you can afford, and that might not be at the same pay rate or level that your employer wishes to take the money. For instance, your employer might just say, I want all of it in your next pay run. You can say no to that. Or you can say yes, or you can say, I want to pay you X amount of dollars in that next pay run and I will give you a certain amount of money moving forward. Another way your employer might seek to deduct is if you quit your job and you don't give the appropriate notice period that's in your contract or provided in the National Employment Standards. For example, if we just go back to the Fair Work Act, in National Employment Standards, it says that if you've been working for not more than a year, then your employer and you are entitled to 1 week's notice. If you're employed for more than 1 year but less than 3, then it's 2 weeks' notice. So let's say you've been working for a year and a half and you must give your employer 2 weeks' notice. And you don't. You decide overnight you're going to resign. You're not a casual, you're a part-time or full-time employee. So you have to give your employer notice and you don't. It's a matter for you and it's certainly a matter for your employer, but just remember that there could be a lawful deduction that gets made at that point. If you are under an award that talks about you not providing the appropriate notice period, then you need to think about whether your employer is going to deduct the amount of notice period from your pay, from your final wages. For instance, it might state that your employer is entitled to deduct 1 week's salary from your pay, and they might go ahead and do that if you don't provide the appropriate notice. But your employer is not allowed to withhold monies because you haven't handed back your work equipment or your uniform, for instance. Okay, who can you speak about this? Now, if you feel that there's been a deduction from your salary or your wages that is unlawful, for instance, you took 2 weeks sick leave and you only had 1 week sick leave accrued, so your employer decides they're going to pay you the rest of your pay but take it off as annual leave, and that's probably an unlawful deduction in regards to your annual leave because you need to approve that leave. You need to ask for it. It needs to be okay. It could be unlawful because your employer has decided you owe them money for some reason. For instance, if we take the example of you using a company car and you having an accident in it, and your employer just takes the excess out of your wages, and there's no written agreement for you to do that, then there would more likely be an unlawful deduction of your wages. Who can you go to talk about that? Certainly the Fair Work Ombudsman might be able to give you some assistance there, but certainly lawyers like myself and my team will be able to give you help about whether the deduction is unlawful or not. We'll be able to talk you through about the sort of things that you can do to assist in how to recover that monies. And we can also talk to you about how to talk to your employer about that unlawful deduction. Sometimes your employer might take the money out not realising that they're not allowed to. Sometimes your employer might take it out knowing they're not allowed to and they don't care. So there are different ways that we can communicate with your employer to A, recover that monies, or B, talk about how you can repay it in some way that makes sense. I get questions all the time, and one of the questions I get is, my employer has deducted money for a course I took. Can they do that? The answer is actually, I don't know. We need to look at your employment contract, we need to look at the awards, we need to look at what sort of employment you have and what promises you've made, and we need to look at what the policies and procedures state, and we need to see if you've provided any written consent about that. Now, some of those things and that criteria might exist and some of them might not, but certainly, actually it's really hard to answer that question off the bat. Another question that comes up is, my employer's told me that they've made a mistake in my wages and now they want me to pay it back. Do I have to do this? The short answer is, if it's a clerical error and they've done it by mistake, then yes, you are required to pay that monies back. But if it is not a clerical error and they've paid it to you and now they just want the money back, then that is a far more complex answer. Broadly speaking, they're not entitled to monies that they paid you purposefully, but it does depend on the agreements that you've signed, what the policies state, how much money they want back, and whether you can afford to pay. So again, obviously there's some complexity there. There's some things that you could probably answer and some things that you probably can't. So we would encourage you to speak to someone who probably knows more about it than perhaps your employer. Like again, we can help you have that conversation with your employer. We can help you try to recover some of that monies back from your employer as well. Another question we get is, I've quit my job and I owe my employer money. Do I have to pay it back? Well, if you know that you owe money to your employer and there's been some sort of agreement there that you do pay that money back, just resigning your job is not going to release you from that obligation. There are other ways your employer can seek to recover that monies. They can certainly seek to recover it in the courts. Under very limited circumstances, they might be able to seek to recover that monies in some sort of small claims court or tribunal, like in Queensland QCAT. But that is under very limited circumstances. If you find that you have put yourself into some sort of debt with your employer and there are some issues with having to pay that back, then we can help you have a conversation with your employer about how you're going to pay it back. There are other organisations that might be able to help you. There's some government organisations out there that can assist. But before you seek to go financially bankrupt, for instance, we would encourage you to look at mediation, some sort of conciliation process, some sort of debt agreement or relationship or arrangement that you can enter into with your employer or ex-employer to be able to pay that monies back. Thank you for watching.